In this video, I'm going to talk to you about the growth of the cattle industry in the West after the Civil War. There are three key developments that you need to know for this part of the American West specification. The first bit relates to the important work of Joseph Mccoy in developing Abilene into the first cow town in the West. The railroad, which we'd explained before, only really goes up to the sort of western edge of Missouri prior to the Civil War. Well, obviously, as the Railroad Act was passed in 1862 and that they're starting to build out now into the West properly, the railroad reaches the town of Abilene, which in 1866, let's say, is a pretty nondescript sort of place, very, very small settlement in Kansas. The railroad hits Abilene in 1867. And Joseph Mccoy, who's a Chicago livestock trader, remember again, we said, didn't we, last time that Chicago was very important in the American cattle industry as a whole, with that massive sort of meat packing industry that they've got there. He sees that Abilene has a lot of potential to become a real hub for the cattle industry. And he thinks that because of, as we said, it's got that link to the railroad. Also, there's a relaxation of quarantine laws in Kansas. That relates to that Texas fever issue that caused so many problems in Missouri prior to the Civil War that we mentioned in the second video. And there's also the fact that it's connected to the Chisholm Trail, which connects sort of Texas Longhorns in the state of Texas with Kansas and with Abilene. That provides a route through Indian Territory. It goes through the grassland, which of course is ideal for cows, which that's their food source. So he sees Abilene as having a lot of opportunities. So what does he do to develop Abilene? A number of key actions. He buys up 450 acres of land. He builds a massive stockyards there where basically, you can take your cows to be stored before they're put on trains and transported to Chicago. He gets a depot built where 100 railway cars could be loaded. Remember, we said again, there's a lot of collaboration between the railroad industry and the cattle farmers. The two were really joined at the hip, if you like, in this period. He builds a hotel where people can stay. He arranges for the Chisholm Trail to be properly marked out. And he advertises his venture. He spends $5,000 on advertising. And these actions see a massive growth in the cattle industry in Abilene. By 1867, 35,000 cattle have been driven along the trail to Abilene. And between 1867 and 1872, 3 million cattle in total will be driven from Texas on foot all the way to Abilene. And Mccoy, unsurprisingly, becomes very rich out of the bargain. Abilene will become the first of a number of cow towns. And you can see, if you look at the map on the left, there are some examples of some others, particularly Dodge City becomes another well-known cattle town as well. And then also further up, you've got towns like Cheyenne in Wyoming over here, which again is going to be another important centre for the cattle industry as it develops. The second key development in the cattle industry in the West is the Goodnight Loving Trail. The Goodnight Loving Trail, and it's marked out on the map there. It's this kind of funny sort of L-shaped trail here. What this is about is satisfying the demand for beef in the West. Now, so this contrasts with Mccoy and Abilene. What Mccoy's trying to do is satisfy the demand for beef in the big eastern cities, in places like Chicago, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, where all the, where a lot of America's population is concentrated and is growing because of the Industrial Revolution. That's what Mccoy's doing. The Goodnight Loving Trail is about satisfying the demand for beef in the West, because remember, lots and lots of people are now moving into the West as the Civil War ends. We've got railroad workers as they expand the Transcontinental Railroad. They need feeding. We've got, people benefiting from the Homestead Act who maybe are taking time to get their crops set up. They need feeding. We've got a massive gold rush to Colorado in the late 1850s. The miners, there's about 300,000 miners that move into Colorado by the end of the 1850s. they need feeding. The US Army is fighting wars against the Plains Indians. They need feeding. The reservations are being built, and the Indians on the reservation um, need feeding because obviously they are having the land they've got for the reservations poor for farming. So there's all these things meaning that there's a need to develop this industry, this cattle industry in the West itself. And the Goodnight Loving trial is very straightforward. Two guys, Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving, um, basically drive a herd of cattle up to Fort Sumner, which is an Indian reservation or near an Indian reservation. It's a US Army base. It's in the New Mexico territory, sort of somewhere about there. If you look at my mouse cursor, and they drive 800 cattle and they sell those cattle for $12,000 to Fort Sumner. Uh, Loving then takes another 1,200 cattle up to Colorado and sells them to John Iliff, who's a rancher who's then going to use that to sell beef to government workers and also to the reservations that are being built in Colorado and Wyoming. Now, Oliver Loving dies in 1867, but Goodnight continues the trail all the way up as far as Cheyenne, Wyoming, in another deal with John Iliff. He also goes through the Colorado mining towns near Denver, for example, which is emerging as one of the big settlements in the West at this time. And actually, the consequence of this is that Wyoming is going to become one of the key cattle states. It's going to be a big hub for the cattle barons, and that's going to have big consequences later on with developments like the Johnson County War that we'll be talking about in a later lesson. So the Goodnight Loving Trail then is about satisfying that demand for beef in the West. Abilene and Mccoy was satisfying that demand for beef in the eastern cities. What's our third development? Well, our third development is the role of John Iliff with cattle ranching. So we mentioned him with the Goodnight Loving Trail. In 1861, he buys a pretty sort of scraggly, exhausted herd of cattle for about $500. And he wants to basically see if he can fatten them up on the grass of the plains. You know, the one thing the plains has got a lot of is grass. Well, that's a perfect conditions for cows to live, surely. And so you can see an opportunity because we've got the Colorado Gold Rush, the Pikes Peak Gold Rush of the late 1850s. There's lots of people wanting food. So he starts his kind of ranching career then. In the 1866, he buys land for a ranch near Denver. And by 1870, he's got a herd of 26,000 cattle. His ranch covers 16,000 acres of land. And he gets that amount of land by manipulating the Homestead Act, by using the Homestead Act kind of against the spirit of that law to build up a big patchwork of claims, almost like a chessboard across the plains. By doing that, it means that he has the claims for some of the land, but it also basically denies access to the unclaimed bits of land to anyone else, basically giving it to him, therefore, by default. He becomes Denver's first millionaire, selling beef to the mining towns, to the railroad workers, and to the government for the reservations, and he becomes known as the cattle king of the plains. His is the first herd that's mainly raised on what's called the open range of the plains, rather than relying only on cattle driven up from Texas. So that actually then ushers in the next big change in the cattle industry, which is moving away from the long drive to the system of ranching on the plains. And that's something that we'll touch on in a later video. So just to summarize, we've got three key people: Goodnight, Mccoy, and Iliff. You need to know each of what they did, their main roles in developing the cattle industry and contributing to the cattle industry's boom, because obviously by the 1870s, we have this period called the beef bonanza, where cattle ranching becomes a massive industry, a booming industry in the West. It was seen as a sure thing to make money because the costs were so low. You could get so much land for not very much money. Cattle were available pretty cheaply, and the profits that you could make were massive. So it says that the best way to make a lot of money was to have these large ranches, these unfenced ranches on the open range, literally, that would sort of go on for miles, huge herds of cattle. You'd then round them up every year when it was time to take them to market. And that's what your cowboys would do. And what we see is a few very rich men backed by very rich investors, dominate the cattle industry. These are the so-called cattle barons. Remember, that really goes against the spirit of the Homestead Act, which is about having lots of small independent farmers, um, you know, with small plots of land that would compete against each other in selling crops. What we're seeing is almost like a monopoly or an oligopoly where a small number of people have huge control over this important aspect of the economy in the West. And not only did these cattle barons control the economy and the land, but they also start to become very influential in politics in places like Colorado and Wyoming. They start to basically influence the election of politicians that will defend their interests. We'll see this used to target rustlers, to put up laws against rustlers, which is a way of attacking the homesteaders, because of course the ranchers and the homesteaders are competing against each other for the land, and that's going to have significant consequences for law and order. And obviously, when we look at the Johnson County War in Wyoming in 1892, we see that as a real example. So to summarise then, just that last slide, you've got a summary of the growth of the cattle industry. What we'll do next is have a look at the life of the cowboy and how that changes in this period.